they might in principle justify the harm that's going to occur, are a little less certain. Looking at sort of non-philosophically, if you look back through human history, there would be or would have been quite a difference if people had looked at war in terms of this simple utilitarian criteria. Very few wars have been fought with any regard at all for the consequences of the war for people on the other side. And even with respect to one's own side, when consequences have been entertained at all, it's only rarely that they've been consequences spelled out specifically for how they'll affect individual people now and in the future. There's some talk about that in the early seminars, the importance of the individual, emphasizing the individual, for utilitarians, individual's well-being, and that's a kind of hallmark feature of utilitarianism. And finally, it's rare, or has been rare for either side to have given much really detailed, serious, empirical thought to what will be the possible gains and losses from a conflict. Of course, it's very common for any side to believe or to claim that the stakes are extremely high and that defeat is unimaginable and great goods are at stake, but it's rare for those claims to actually be warranted or to be justified or even well defended. Whereas I think if utilitarianism were taken seriously as the ultimate criteria for when it's legitimate to wage war, there'd be a stronger emphasis to actually look at more carefully at those things. If you're a utilitarian, then of course you're going to gravitate toward the utilitarian criteria of when a war is right or when a war is wrong. But what I put forward, what I stated to you, the idea that a war is, it's right for a state to wage war if and only if nothing else it could do would yield greater expected benefit, that's a sort of fairly specific normative principle of a limited domain, which I believe you can accept from other moral perspectives. You don't have to be a utilitarian to agree that that's the right criteria for judging when a war is morally correct or incorrect. Now, how could that be? Well, one easy way is you could not be a utilitarian because you're a consequentialist of some other stripe. So, but put that aside. Suppose you're just an ordinary non-consequentialist, like probably the majority of you are. I think you have to take account of the fact that the utilitarian criteria that I stated corresponds to common sense. I think it's very hard it would be very hard for ordinary people to believe that it's right to fight a war if the consequences of doing so on balance are going to be worse than the consequences of not having fought that war. And if you have suitably broad understanding of what constitutes human well-being, so that includes, as it would for Mill and other great utilitarians, freedom, self-determination, then you could go all the way, from the point of view of common sense, to endorse the utilitarian criteria that war is justified only if and only if human beings as a whole are better off as a result of it than they would have been if you hadn't fought the war. For most non-consequentialists allow some role for consequences in their moral judgments. And that's especially true when the choices they're making have the potential to affect the well-being of many, many people in really serious ways. So even if you believe that utilitarian is not the whole answer, you may well think that consequences are really what matters in these kinds of choices where what's at stake are the really serious factors affecting human well-being on a large scale. So what I'm suggesting, I can't prove it, is that many non-consequentialists will find or could find the utilitarian criteria of when war is morally right to be an acceptable middle-level normative principle, the validity of which is evident on reflection and which coheres, I think, with judgments we want to make about what wars are right and what wars are wrong or have been right or have been wrong in human history. I'd like to add along the same line that many of the reasons philosophers have for rejecting utilitarianism, the idea that it's insensitive to distribution, that it demands too much of individuals, that it conflicts with ordinary moral rules, that it's too impersonal or coldly calculating, that ignores our individual attachments or personal commitments, or the specific obligations we have, that it falters as a personal ethic. I think all these criticisms, whatever merit they have or don't have, are irrelevant as criticisms of the utilitarian criteria of when it's right for a state to wage a war. Those common criticisms are irrelevant to the use of utilitarianism in this case of a large issue of public policy. The idea that it's too demanding and that it ignores personal obligations, I think those are sort of irrelevant. That in these sorts of situations, like making a judgment about the rightness or wrongness of war, are exactly when we want decision makers to be impartial, to be dispassionate, to be coldly calculating, to be rational deliberators who try to look at the big picture and just focus on the consequences. Now, even so, there are going to be objections to the utilitarian criteria of war. Let me just say simply, because one would be that utilitarian calculations are abused or could be abused. And that's true, but that's also true for all sorts of just war thinking, that it can be and has been abused. Critics, even of this limited principle, this limited utilitarian principle about war, would think that the consequences of our choices are unforeseeable. And that, of course, that has to be granted. We don't able to predict the future. And we can go on as utilitarians to add all the great types of mistakes people can make. They can overlook possible alternative courses of action. They can misjudge the probable effects of those courses of actions that they do consider, either by missing some of the outcomes they're likely to have or miscalculating those probabilities. Decision makers can have faulty background assumptions. They can suffer from bias, wishful thinking, all those cognitive errors having to do with framing and anchoring effects, as well as self-interest, emotion, social pressure. So lots of things can go wrong with everybody's reasoning, and certainly can go wrong with utilitarian reasoning. But I don't think the situation's hopeless, and we use this sort of reasoning in lots of other areas, and I think we can make judgments about at least some past wars that they were wrong, and perhaps about some past wars that they were right. And even if it's difficult about many wars to say whether they were right or wrong, that doesn't impugn in principle the right criteria. It just means some moral questions are difficult to resolve. Still, it'd be nice if we had some kind of useful way or some guidance in moving from this very abstract principle, this kind of high-level judgment about, at the end of the day, when is a war right or wrong, to practical action. And here I think that standard principles of jus ad bellum in just war theory can help. They can help provide a framework or guidance that utilitarians could avail themselves of. So I think even though these are logically incompatible or can give you logically different answers in theory, I think in practice would be very rare to find a war that satisfied suitably interpreted ad bellum principles and failed the utilitarian principle, and vice versa. Moreover, the ad bellum principles draw our attention to a series of discrete factors that are going to be important from a utilitarian point of view. I mean, some of them obviously are like proportionality and last resort, but even ones like right intention and just cause have a utilitarian rationale behind them. And so by focusing your attention on those principles, I think you're more likely to get a judgment that ultimately satisfies the utilitarian criteria of when war is right than if you just try to kind of wing it by yourself. Moreover, those principles are widely known, utilized, they're taught at the service academy, so there's good reason for a utilitarian to want to avail himself of those principles and sort of in effect to adopt them as the lower level normative principles that we would use in our kind of workaday decisions about, and workaday decisions and sort of public debate about when it would be permissible to go to war or not. Again, making it more likely that by following those intermediate principles, or in Mill's phrase, intermediate generalizations, we'll be more likely to get the answer that would be correct from the abstract utilitarian perspective. Now, I'm not saying that the utilitarian principle should be abandoned in favor of the jus ad bellum principles. and that's for at least two reasons. First, those principles are not self-interpreting. They require elaboration and refinement, and the utilitarian criterion, or looking at it from the point of view of the ultimate utilitarian criteria of when war is right, would give you some framework for revising and refining those ad bellum principles. And secondly, the ad bellum principles, as I see them, today lack theoretical foundation. People either think they're just intuitively plausible, which to some extent they are, I agree, or it's a matter of tradition and we should just accept them because they've been handed down, they represent the wisdom of the ages. My colleague George Lucas refers to this as methodological anarchy in one of his essays, and so I think utilitarianism would give you a framework that could tie together and ultimately underpin those sometimes seemingly ad hoc ad bellum principles. I don't know how much time I have.
5 minutes.
Okay, let me just, I don't want to go too far into this because, you know, if you're not sort of sympathetic to utilitarianism, it won't be so interesting to you, but there's 2 or 3 different ways utilitarians can think about rules, and which of those ways is the way that I want us to think about the ad bellum rules? Well, one would be just to think of what are normally thought of as the moral rules as being just rules of thumb, that they don't really have moral weight themselves, but are merely kind of pragmatic guidelines that we can just set aside whenever we wish. So as a general matter, that's one view utilitarians have about rules. I think that's not appropriate in this case. I think even though the ad bellum rules, on my view, are ultimately subordinate to the utilitarian criteria of when war is just, they also reflect widespread intuitions, moral intuitions that I think, and sentiments that utilitarians will want to take seriously because they're intuitions that utilitarians will want us to have. Because people have those intuitions, namely, for example, you shouldn't fight a war if it's not the last resort. Utilitarians want people to have that intuition because if they do, they're less likely to be fighting wars that utilitarianism wouldn't want them to fight in the first place. On the other hand, so that's my sort of intermediate position. I don't want to go all the way to a kind of rule utilitarian perspective, which would sort of efface the utilitarian criteria altogether in favor of the ad bellum principles. I think we'd want that. We'd want to get rid of utilitarianism on rule of utilitarian grounds and just have the ad bellum principles, only if we thought that would give us better results. And I don't see any reason for thinking that. So I would hang on to the utilitarian criteria to use it to guide us in the interpretation and development and refinement of the ad bellum principles, ultimately trying to work to get those principles so that they yield the results that would mesh best with the kind of ideally applied utilitarian standard. And even so, there may be cases in which, maybe relatively rare, but cases in which the answer is still not clear at the end of the day, and you might conceivably have to step out of the ad bellum framework and make some more direct appeal to utilitarianism. So I don't want to rule out that possibility.
Thank you. We have a half hour for questions. Just let us know to whom the question is addressed.
This is a comment addressed to Bill. You said when you were explaining why the utilitarian approach is appealing, that the criterion for when war is wrong on the utilitarian view is strong when it would be worse for people in the world if it's fought than if it wasn't fought. And I just wanted to point out that's a rather misleading way of describing what utilitarianism says, because there are a lot of things that one could do other than fighting a war. There are an indefinite number of possible things that one could do. You're lumping all of those together in a way that I think is illegitimate in that statement, because it might be the case that war is the second best of all the possible things that we could do. And utilitarianism would